For whatever reason, you guys really want to see Vanilla Arch on the show, despite it being the antithesis to the context of the show and to the Distro Delves checklist. The Zen Installer is an installer program for Arch. It basically automates the install and bootstrap of a vanilla Arch install. As far as I can tell, it's written in pure bash and it's made from a couple of other Arch installers that have come and gone over the years. The installer is quite a little beast. It's also a nice little live session too. Since this is Distro Delves and not Installer Delves, I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. I'm more interested in what the Zen Installer produces rather than the installer itself. It does do all of the basic things like set up your keyboard and locale, partitions your disks and your boot stuff and whatever else. You can choose the kernel type, which I think is a pretty cool feature. There's a bunch of different software presets as well as some cool additional repos that you can enable from here, which is probably pretty useful. There's also a ton of desktops, and I went with the basic KDE desktop here, which probably wasn't the best idea, which we'll see about in just a moment. I've heard so many of you say that the KDE experience on Arch is the best out there, so let's check it out. I chose Simple Display Manager as the default, and the login screen looks, simple? But right out of the gate, we get an error message from Octopi saying it can't connect to the internet. Oh boy. The first thing I usually do here is bust out a terminal and check out df and free, but there's no terminal installed. So this is a reoccurring thing in the episode. Basically nothing is installed, but that's because this is a basic KDE install, which again, probably wasn't the best choice for this episode in retrospect, but here we are. I needed to install a terminal and Dolphin, the file manager, and a couple other things, but let's just move on, shall we? In df, we see an install size of 8.9 gigabytes? How? That seems really large for such a bare bones install. The memory usage was a super low 436 megabytes though, so that's good. Hopping over to HTOP, we see 53 tasks and 112 threads. KDE once again showing us just how petite of a desktop it is. And speaking of KDE, the defaults just aren't great. Single mouse click, session restore on login, a rather bright light theme, and arguably dated window decorations and so on. This obviously isn't an Arch thing, it's just the KDE defaults and they need to be revisited. Seeing that this is basically vanilla Arch here, there's nothing special at all about this KDE install, so there's no real point spending a bunch of time here on it. I guess the thing that stood out most to me is that there's no user home skeleton, but that's just an Arch thing. The backgrounds were all right, it's standard KDE again. There's not even an Arch logo in here, which is surprising, but at the same time not. The application selection was really weird for being so basic. There's a number of development apps here, as well as some miscellaneous ones like a v4L2 app and a pair of VNC things, like what? In NeoFetch land, we see the snazzy Arch logo along with kernel version 5.4.42, 628 packages installed in Bash 5.0.17. This is KDE Plasma all the way down with no customizations or anything, the default Breeze icon theme, and that's it. Now, much to my surprise, all of the removable media stuff worked. The encrypted drive had that weird error after mounting for the first time, but it was fine, and the exFAT SD card mounted just fine without any issues or requiring additional packages. No archive manager or media player was installed by default, so I went ahead and installed Arc and VLC since that's what KDE Neon uses. All of these archive files opened just fine, including the RAR file, which I didn't explicitly include support for. All of the audio files worked good, and all of the video files played back just fine without any stuttering or anything. Now, app images did not work out of the box because the OS is missing Fuse support, and there's obviously no Flatpak or Snap support out of the box. Software is provided by Arch's amazing tooling and repos. I installed the NVIDIA drivers right here through Octopi using NVIDIA Linux LTS drivers or whatever, since I chose the LTS kernel during the install. The drivers installed without any issues at all, which is pretty damn impressive for a rolling distro like Arch, honestly. I installed Steam and OBS through Octopi, and recording with OBS worked just fine right out of the box without any issues whatsoever. So networking didn't work at all. No Samba, no DLNA, and not even SSH or fish support from Dolphin. I enabled printer support from the installer, but since the HP stuff isn't installed, there's no auto detection or drivers. Bluetooth also didn't work because there weren't any drivers or anything installed there either. And yes, I know that I could install and configure all of this stuff from scratch, but This is Distro Delves, not set up your very own Arch install Delves, and this episode is already taking forever to produce, so I'm sure that it all works just fine. It's just not in the scope of this video to go through and set up and configure everything. The performance segment of the episode is probably going to be the most interesting so far because all we've really seen up until this point is a vanilla KDE setup and a really lightweight Arch install. Since there's no Bluetooth, I had to play dirt on the keyboard, which is interesting. I didn't notice any lag or stuttering at all, and the dirt benchmark reported Arch getting 10 frames higher than our baseline Ubuntu with 48 frames a second. So War Thunder is a bit broken, maybe? Not sure why, it's probably some sort of driver issue, but the benchmark didn't do this. This is only happening in the game, like playing a match or whatever. The benchmark is in the game, but it's different because this is like we're actually playing it. Arch did a bit better than our baseline here too, with 2 frames a second higher than Ubuntu. But it's worth pointing out that the benchmarks are cool, but if this sort of thing is happening in the game and it's not happening in the benchmark, then it doesn't really matter what the frames a second are. Like, you can't play like this. And GTA's performance just wasn't great. Again, it reported a higher frame rate than Ubuntu with 20 frames a second, but the gameplay is just like, it was stuttery, it just wasn't good. And since I'm doing the chart fly-in thing now, I'm going to show the Geekbench stuff at the end of this segment rather than dedicating a segment to it so I can just kind of talk over it. The TLDR of it is that Arch did a bit better than Ubuntu on the CPU scores, but Ubuntu actually edged out Arch on the Vulkan scores. And with that, we finally have Arch on the show. Was it worth it? No, I don't think so. I can usually produce a Distro Delves episode from start to finish in about 24 hours, but this episode took me about 3 days, and honestly the results aren't really that interesting, to me anyway. To you guys, this looks like one single flowing install because of how I've edited it, but in reality, I reinstalled this damn thing 4 different times to get good quality footage and test results and stuff, and the damn Zen installer locked up on me probably a half dozen times. And at the end, all we basically see is a very lightweight KDE install with no customizations at all. There's stuff to be said about Arch though. I mean, my NVIDIA drivers worked right out of the box, the archive and codec formats were all supported without any issues. That's great stuff. But the distro itself, like the entire package, it's not really a great or interesting candidate for the show. I could see maybe building Arch from scratch during a live stream or something in the future, but in order to make a good Distro Delves episode that is both interesting and engaging, the distro in question needs to possess some kind of charm or character, and let's be honest, Arch just doesn't. Being super lightweight and fast, whatever that means, isn't exactly a charming attribute. Like, it's not cool to look at or even really cool to talk about. Like, we all know that Arch is lightweight and fast. I mean, do we really need a video to tell us that? I don't know. Besides, there's lots of other videos out there talking about Arch and building it from scratch, so now we have an Arch episode on the show. Cool. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of Distro Delves, and if you did, be sure to leave a like and a comment and all that good stuff. If you enjoy the show and you want to support it or me, you can hop on over to Patreon and become a patron of mine. I appreciate all your support, and thanks for watching.